Some crises arrive like a thunderclap, a sudden, violent crack that shatters the calm and demands immediate attention. Others creep in silently, a slow, rising tide that goes unnoticed until it's already washing over our feet. But whether loud or quiet, most crises share one common, unsettling trait: they rarely end cleanly. This is a story about a crisis that didn't fade away, but was declared over. It begins with a moment that forced everyone to stop and look. A situation so serious it disrupted daily life, triggered emergency protocols, and pulled officials into immediate, urgent action. At the time, it was the only thing that mattered. The response was swift, necessary, and important. And then, just as suddenly as it had erupted, it was over. An official announcement was made. The crisis has been resolved. The danger, they said, had passed. There was no longer any reason for concern. The public was reassured, and life was encouraged to return to normal. For most people, that was enough. A collective sigh of relief was breathed. Attention, so recently fixed on this single point, began to scatter. The moment faded from headlines, then from conversations. But here's the thing about resolution. It doesn't always bring understanding. Because while the crisis was officially finished, the full story never quite arrived. Let's go back to the beginning. The initial response was textbook. Authorities moved quickly. Established procedures were followed. Communication channels, from emergency alerts to press briefings, hummed to life. The situation was serious enough to require a high level of coordination, control, and oversight. From the outside, it all appeared remarkably organized, efficient, even calm. Statements were released carefully, with words chosen to reassure, not to alarm. The message was consistent and clear. The situation is under control. We are handling it. Yet, even in those first critical hours and days, the details were sparse. Not every question was answered. Not all information was shared. Certain aspects were mentioned briefly, then left hanging, unexplored. Other details were omitted entirely. At the time, this didn't seem strange. In an emergency, information often trickles out slowly. Officials are rightly focused on action first, on solving the immediate problem. Explanation can come later. But in this case, later never fully came. Instead, the announcement of resolution arrived with surprising speed. The crisis was resolved. There was no extended briefing to follow up. No comprehensive report was released to the public. There was no clear, step-by-step breakdown of what had happened, why it happened, and what was learned from it. The declaration marked an end, but it felt abrupt. For some observers, it felt too abrupt. As the days turned into weeks, this lack of follow-up became more and more noticeable. There were no updates expanding on the initial, bare-bones explanation. No detailed clarifications for the public. No public review of the response to see what went right and what could be improved. The event wasn't denied. The official account wasn't contradicted. It just stopped being discussed. The media, which had been so intensely focused on the crisis, moved on. News stories filled the airwaves and timelines. Attention shifted elsewhere. Without a steady stream of new information, the crisis quietly slipped into the background. And this is how so many unresolved moments fade, not through a grand conspiracy of secrecy, but through the simple, deafening power of silence. Of course, official records still existed. Reports were filed. Documents were dutifully archived. But these records were often fragmented, filled with technical jargon, and difficult for an ordinary person to access or understand. Without context, without a guiding narrative, they did little to answer the questions that still lingered over time. The event itself became harder to define, harder to remember clearly, harder to explain to someone who wasn't there. People who experienced it firsthand remembered the feeling of urgency, the sudden disruption, the seriousness of the official response. But those sharp, personal memories weren't reinforced by any public discussion. No anniversaries were marked. No official reassessments revisited the event. No long-term impact was ever formally acknowledged. The crisis remained resolved, but it was never truly examined. This brings us to a really important question. Why are some crises declared over so quickly, with so little explanation? In many cases, the reasons are practical. Declaring a resolution helps restore stability. It reduces public fear and anxiety. It allows critical systems, from transportation to the economy, to return to normal. Officials often have to prioritize creating calm over providing complex and potentially alarming details, especially when lingering uncertainty could lead to panic or unrest. But clarity and calm are not the same thing. A crisis can be operationally resolved, meaning the immediate danger is gone while remaining conceptually unresolved. And when that happens, the questions don't just disappear. They just lose their momentum. Once normal life resumes, public pressure fades. Without the spotlight of media attention, there's very little incentive for officials to go back and revisit the messy details. The story doesn't continue because there's no longer a demand for it to continue. Silence becomes the default ending. This doesn't automatically mean the response was ineffective. It doesn't imply that any wrongdoing occurred or that there was a cover-up. It simply means that providing a full, transparent explanation was never made a priority. And without that explanation, a true sense of closure remains incomplete, just out of reach. Over the years, references to this particular crisis became increasingly rare. When it was mentioned at all, it was in obscure technical documents or as a brief historical footnote in an academic paper. For most people, it no longer existed as a defined, memorable event, only as a vague memory, if they remembered it at all. The crisis had ended, but our understanding of it never had a chance to begin. This pattern isn't unique. History is filled with moments just like this one. Events that demanded immediate, decisive action, but never received long-term, public reflection. They exist in a strange limbo, somewhere between acknowledgement and analysis, between response and understanding. They aren't hidden. They aren't erased from the record. They are simply left unfinished. And unfinished stories are the easiest ones to forget. Today, the official status of the crisis remains unchanged, resolved. But as we've seen, resolution doesn't always mean the story is complete. The very speed with which it was declared over left behind a trail of unanswered questions. Questions that were never formally addressed in a public forum. Questions that now no longer have an audience waiting for an answer. And that is what makes this kind of crisis so significant, not just what happened, but how quickly it was packaged, shelved, and moved on from. Some crises end with detailed explanations. Some end with hard-won lessons that change the way we do things, and some just end with an announcement, followed by silence. This was one of them. Thanks for watching. If you find these kinds of stories as fascinating as I do, consider subscribing for more deep dives into the events that shape our world. See you next time.